Hi, my name's Tom, and I'm a local hot air balloon pilot here in Pennsylvania, and I've been asked to talk to you today about the science of hot air balloons. I got associated with Big Brothers and Big Sisters through a friend who's on your staff, and I'm excited to share a little bit about what I do. So where should we start this new adventure in ballooning? Well, there's no better place to start than with a brief history. In June 1783, two French brothers, Joseph-Michel Montgolfier and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier, make the first practical hot air balloon using a linen envelope lined with paper. Instead of gas burners, they use a simple fire made of wood and straw. The first passengers weren't even people, but a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Those three flew for 8 minutes and traveled 3.2 kilometers. The first manned free balloon carried two men, Francois Rosier and Francois Laurent, later that year, November of 1783. The two men stood on a circular platform attached to the bottom of the balloon and hand-fed the fire through openings on either side of the balloon skirt. The balloon reached an altitude of at least 500 feet and traveled about 5.5 miles before landing safely 25 minutes later. The first manned flight of a balloon in America occurred on January 9, 1793. It was a hydrogen gas balloon piloted by the same Frenchman who was the first to cross the English Channel, Jean-Pierre Blanchard. This flight ascended from a prison yard in Philadelphia to a height of about 5,800 feet and later made a successful landing in New Jersey. George Washington was an observer of this launch. Later in 1960, Paul Yost and 3 others formed Raven Industries in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and developed what we now call the modern hot air balloon and the propane gas burner, which makes sustainable flight possible. On October 22, 1960, Yost piloted the maiden flight of the new balloon on a flight that lasted 25 minutes, traveling over 3 miles. Now that we've learned about how modern hot air ballooning started, let's take a look at one. Here's a diagram of a modern hot air balloon. The balloon is comprised of 3 main sections: the envelope, or colorful fabric section of the balloon, the burner, which provides heat in order to fly, and the basket where the pilot and passenger stand. The envelope is made up of nylon or polyester sections called gores, which are sewn together with fabric webbing called vertical and horizontal load tapes. These provide strength to carry the weight of the basket and passengers, as well as provide support, helping the envelope maintain its shape. The load tapes are connected to a metal ring at the top of the balloon, called a load ring, and to suspension cables at the bottom. The suspension cables then connect the envelope to the basket. Let's take a closer look at the basket and burner. The basket is made from wicker, which is hand-woven by a craftsman in varying shapes and sizes. This allows the basket to be flexible and absorb some of the impact when landing. In the basket are the fuel tanks, which hold the liquid propane, and they are connected to the burner with fuel hoses, which run up the uprights. The fuel hoses are protected by leather covers, which are in place over the uprights during assembly. The burner sits atop of the burner frame and is used by the pilot to heat the air trapped inside the envelope to make the balloon fly. Modern burners will have an output of 6 to 12 million BTUs, or British thermal units, each. To compare, most home furnaces produce only 90,000 BTUs. It would take about 500 gas grills on high to produce the same amount of heat as one hot air balloon burner. So what happens with all that heat generated by the burner? When the pilot activates the burner, air molecules trapped inside the envelope are heated. As they're heated, they begin to move around and expand outwards. The higher the temperature of the air inside the envelope compared to outside the envelope makes it less dense. As this happens, the balloon expands to its full shape and lift begins to develop. Let's listen to Sarah as she explains this.
Well, things that are more dense will sink, and the same is true with our balloon. The hot air inside the balloon is less dense than the cool air outside, so the balloon can float up. In fact, warm air always floats up.
So if warm air always floats up, how can the hot air balloon pilot bring the balloon back down? Well, there are 2 ways. First, if the pilot doesn't heat the air in the balloon, eventually it will cool and begin to descend. The second way is by pulling on a vent line in the balloon basket, which is attached to an opening called a parachute vent at the top of the envelope. Pulling the rope allows the pilot to vent some of the hot air out the top, cooling the envelope, allowing it to go down. We've talked about the history of hot air ballooning, and we've learned a little bit about how a hot air balloon works. Let's take a look at a typical flight day and watch a balloon in action. On the day of the flight, we have several tasks as a pilot that we must complete. We first conduct an initial weather check to get an overall sense of the wind direction, wind speed, available launch sites, and probable landing sites. Based on this information, we make a selection for where to have the crew meet us and which launch site we feel will provide us with the safest flight and the most landing site opportunities. Approximately 1 hour prior to our anticipated launch time, we will conduct a final official weather briefing from the FAA to confirm the weather is appropriate and safe for a flight. When we arrive at the launch site, we inspect the area for potential hazards, determine the wind direction, and select the balloon placement to ensure a safe launch. A crew briefing is done to tell each member what their task will be for this day's flight. Next, we remove the balloon from the trailer and begin assembly. We start by pulling the envelope bag, basket, and inflation fan out of the trailer and placing them a safe distance away. Next, we begin to assemble the basket by attaching the uprights, burner frame, and connecting the fuel hoses. Each balloon is slightly different, so the pilot will use a checklist to ensure the balloon basket is assembled properly. Once the balloon basket is assembled, the pilot will complete a checklist to verify all the major systems and components of the basket are connected correctly prior to laying it down and connecting the envelope. This includes verifying fuel pressure, completing a test firing of the burner, and an instrument check. After the basket is assembled, checked, tested, and laid down, the envelope suspension cables are connected to the burner frame and the envelope is stretched out. The way I prefer to lay out my envelope whenever possible is the spread layout method as seen in this photo. The balloon is pulled away from the center until the envelope takes its normal shape while still on the ground. After all the connections are checked, the balloon inflation fan is started, and the envelope will fill with cold air. While this is happening, one last final check of the balloon is made by the pilot. When the balloon is sufficiently cold inflated, it's time to begin the hot inflation. The next 2 video clips will show you that process from both your perspective as a bystander and mine as a pilot. Once the balloon is inflated and standing, the pilot will secure any loose lines, verify the altimeter setting and the gauges are operational, and finally invite any passengers to board. Once the passengers are on board, the pilot will conduct a final briefing regarding where the passenger may stand, what they may or may not touch, proper landing position, and stowing of any items they brought with them during launch and landing. A final thumbs up and a photo, then we're off. As we climb out from the launch site, I will use a series of short burns until the desired altitude is reached. Once at altitude, I will level off and continue frequent short burns to maintain the desired flight level. Let's see what a launch would look like from a pilot or passenger perspective. As we take off, I'm verifying the ascent rate is adequate to clear any obstacles in my flight path, looking for other aircraft in the area, and identifying landing options in case of an emergency. While flying at low levels, we try to maintain what is known as a sterile cockpit. During this phase, along with landing, any unnecessary communication is limited to ensure the flight has the pilot's full attention. So at this point in the flight, we're up in the air, allowing our passengers and ourselves to enjoy the view from high above, just floating along with the wind. One question I always get asked is, can you steer a balloon? As you can see this graphic from one of my flight paths, I definitely have the ability to change direction while flying, but not in the typical sense. In order to steer my balloon, I must change altitude and enter a layer of wind moving in a different direction. Most people are surprised to find out that the wind doesn't travel in the same direction from ground level to the clouds. Sometimes the change in direction isn't any farther apart than just the height of my balloon. On the screen now is an example of the Rapid Update Cycle or RUC wind soundings. This is a wind model that's provided on an hourly basis and allows balloon pilots to anticipate the wind direction at the different altitudes listed. As you can see, the wind has a pretty consistent direction from 0 to 2,021 feet, but starts to change significantly at 2,706 feet and above. One thing to remember is this is just a forecast. There are many other layers in between in varying directions and speed. In order to end up at a specific location, we work backwards from where we want to land, using the forecasted wind directions to pick our launch location. This graphic is a screenshot of my onboard flight tracking software. Most pilots use this or a similar type of GPS software to track their flights and obtain GPS-based readings of our actual flight direction and speed. Next to the display of the wind speed and direction of travel is the flight track for this flight. When I launched and was climbing to 900 feet, I actually was flying away from my target, the white cluster of buildings in the lower right part of the graphic. As I climbed to 1100 feet, I was able to turn and fly towards my landing site. By the time I got near the end of my flight, the difference in the shape of the ground, along with the trees and buildings in that area, changed how the wind was moving and provided the crazy changes in direction which allowed me to land where I planned. There's a lot of things that go into steering a balloon, and sometimes, despite all of your planning, it's still a surprise. Let's take a look at a 3D image of one of my craziest flights where I flew in a circle at the end of the launch field and was able to just watch the balloons go by. Now, let's take a look at this from inside a balloon at 6,000 feet over Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Here we are at 6,000 feet and still slightly climbing, looking at the beautiful Susquehanna River near the Wrightsville Bridge. I launched off to the right of your screen, heading towards the river, and at this point have turned northeast and am flying away from it. Another balloon is flying with me, and you'll see him come into the screen from the bottom right, climbing into the frame, flying across behind me towards the river. As he reaches the altitude I'm at, he too turns away from the river and flies to the northeast next to me as we level out at 6,200 feet, heading towards Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Now that you've had a chance to see a direction change at altitude, let's watch another much closer to the ground as I try and land next to that other balloon. Pay attention to how the balloon direction changes to the right as I descend over the small trees, then to the left as I climb, then back to the right as I go even higher, finally then back to the left as I come into the field to make sure I hit my target. The end of the video clip is in real time for you to experience a pilotized view of a landing. If you listen closely, you will even hear when I pull the vent line we discussed earlier to help the balloon descend and hit my mark.
Yep.
Now that the flight is over and we're safely back on the ground, there's still work to be done. Now it's time to squeeze the air out of the balloon so it can be packed back into the envelope bag. There are several methods to squeeze out the air, but one of the easiest and fastest is to put the balloon under your arm and walk from the basket to the crown as seen here. Once this is done and the basket disassembled, it's time to pack up the truck or trailer and head off to get some well-earned food. One of the most enjoyable parts of ballooning is the time spent with others. This is definitely not a sport that you can do on your own. This brings us to the last thing I want to talk to you about today, mentoring. My journey in ballooning started with a man named John and a simple question. Would you like to go for a ride today? He noticed my inquisitiveness at how he and the other crew were setting up the balloon and simply thought it would be a nice gesture to include me on the flight. Once I said yes and had my first flight, I was hooked. The next photos are from my first flight, my first landing as a student pilot, first and second solo flights, and finally my landing on my check ride where I earned my private pilot's license. Mentoring plays a critical role in becoming a balloon pilot. Many instructors don't charge for their time to instruct the new pilots. While there are schools that you can attend, more often than not you start by crewing, then going along for some flights, and then finally becoming a student pilot and buying the crew breakfast and paying for propane on the lesson days. Once you're a pilot, you continue mentoring by training crew, helping other pilots, and doing activities just like this presentation. Just last year, I had a couple that was watching the setup of my balloon and asking similar questions as I did on that first day. At the very same festival, I had asked those questions. My response? Well, you guessed it, it was the same that was given to me. I asked the person, would you like to go for a ride? During the flight, I found out that he was a pilot and had always wanted to go for a balloon ride. It's important that you take the time to mentor others and look for opportunities to return what your mentor has done for you to them. Sometimes, though, it's tough or even scary to say yes when somebody asks you to do something. Oftentimes, though, that yes leads to some great opportunities. I've experienced that myself. My instructor and mentor one day asked me if I wanted to go to Israel with him to help crew and fly balloons. I, of course, said yes, and then had to figure out for a way to pay for the trip. As a result of that simple word, yes, I had the chance to experience a new culture, meet many new friends, and even help inspire a country after a rocket attack by tethering a balloon with 2 acrobats performing below. Take a look at this short video about that experience.
Now you see the rat cheese balloon being piloted by Tom Imler of the United States while supporting aerial acrobats. Pretty cool, huh? And there they come, missing the street lights. It's all good. Give these folks a hand. Well, hey, Mr. Barnum, what do you have to say for yourself?
I could get used to this.
As a result of that trip and the continued mentorship role from my instructor, I now have had the chance to meet so many wonderful people, explore the world, and return the favor by helping a friend and newer pilot continue to grow his skills. By being open to being mentored, taking advantage of new opportunities, and looking for ways to give back, expands your knowledge, provides personal growth, and helps others to achieve their goals and dreams. Thanks for letting me share a little of my story with you today. I hope you learned a little bit about ballooning, and be sure to check back tomorrow for what Big Brothers and Big Sisters has lined up for you next. Fair winds and soft landings, my new friends, as you live a great story. Your story.